Alrighty, everyone. It's 6:32, so figured we get started here. My name is Joseph Roy. I'm on the Conservation Commission, and this is the rest of our Conservation Commission staff or volunteers. If you want to just introduce yourself quickly.
Sam, Samantha.
Michael.
Roberta. Jessica.
And Jessica's got the sign-in sheet over there. And before we start this whole thing, just want to let folks know, we do have an opening on the Conservation Commission, so if anyone wants to volunteer, let us know. Talk to the town office. We're always looking for more people. So, cool. Anyways, do you want to go to the slide?
Why don't you just do yours?
Yeah. So cool. Figured tonight we'd start off and kind of talk about who we are and why we're here and what the goals and objectives for tonight's public meeting are. Most of you are probably like me, received one of these postcards in the mail, so it means you are impacted or potentially impacted landowner. So to start off, we're the Conservation Commission. So what we do is we really work to help enhance the rural characteristic of Durham, and we do that through working with our water resources and our forestry resources and all the different sort of conservation resources we have in town. In the past, we've had some work that we've tried to get involved with on our parks, and we also just advocate for the resources here in the town and work with organizations like Royal River Conservation Trust and willing landowners who are looking to do conservation on their property. And we can also just be a source of material for all of you to ask resource-related questions here in town. A lot of us are professionals who work in the field of either wildlife biology or environmental science, and we are completely volunteer board. We're here tonight talking to you about regulations, but we have absolutely no regulatory authority. We purely just help advise our select board and our planning board when they have questions about this sort of stuff or are looking for additional capacity. And we're just here to kind of act as more people hours that can be thrown at tasks and projects. So that's who we are, and now that we'll talk about why we're here. We were asked by the planning board to kind of help facilitate discussions around potential resource protection changes and what that process looks like and what it means for the town and for impacted landowners. So they reached out to us and asked if we would help out, and we said sure. George has been working his tail off, they're working their tail off, and they just need a little bit more capacity as we prepare for our meeting in April next year. So like I said, we're assisting them as they try to bring us into compliance with the voter-approved 2018 comprehensive plan. So the town planning board's busy, and we're just here to help. So I mentioned it, but talking about the 2018 comprehensive plan, really this plan was developed by a committee and then brought to the voters and voted on. And the plan highlighted a lot of really important factors that were determined to be important to the people of Durham. Mostly that was keeping Durham rural and maintaining the rural characteristic of Durham. So some of the key land use issues that were highlighted in this comprehensive plan were that we wanted to preserve rural characteristic, preserve farming and forestry, and balance that with private property and public rights and public land use. So as part of the plan, the planning committee did a survey and found that 90% of the people in this town support farming, 75% support forestry, and of the surveyed people, 75% said they also supported expanding the resource protection district to achieve those sorts of land use goals. And then, to break it down even further, they really want to preserve our rural characteristic and preserve all of the land use that is associated with that. So some of the main discussions that came up with this were on our water resources and our natural resources here in the town of Durham. And essentially, the comprehensive plan wants to make recommendations to consider critical natural resources in the community, to promote the development of floodplain areas, to prohibit development in floodplain areas, to help protect life and property and preserve natural habitats, to protect, identify rare endangered plants and animal species from degradation, and to preserve, protect areas with significant level of natural resources, and to coordinate with local groups and neighboring communities and regional land resources to help protect shared natural resources. And all of that wants to be done in the context of a framework that still allows for things like forestry, farming, and agriculture, which are really important to all of us here in Durham and really help make up that rural characteristic in the town. So that's kind of the backdrop. But through that whole process was developed a handful of criteria that were going to be considered into adding into the resource protection zone in town to change the resource protection zone from its current zoning framework to something that more reflects the town's objectives and culture and goals now, because it's been about 20 years. So George is going to kind of go through today and discuss what that looks like. And this is something that we're going to be meeting again about in the beginning of the year and then voting on at the town's meeting in April in 2 phases. One phase will be, to remove some resources from resource protection, aligning with new framework, and then one phase would be to add them into that. So George is going to go into a little bit more of those details today. What we're hoping to do here is to just help people understand what resource protection is, why we're here talking about it, how it impacts your land, if it impacts your land, what's allowable and not allowable, and answer any sort of other questions that might come up, as well as answer questions about what the process moving forward may look like. So George is going to present a handful of slides, but we'll be here to answer questions, take names, and follow up with anyone if needed. So I'll hand off to George.
Thank you, Joe. Yeah, my name is George Tavarge, and I'm the town planner. And since the adoption of the 2018 comprehensive plan, I've been working doing research on implementation of the recommendations of that plan in some of the areas that Joe mentioned, natural resources, but also in other areas, historic preservation. And I've been working on this particular project, doing research initially with the planning board. And as Joe said, the planning board, they review projects all the time, subdivisions and site plans. And so pretty much I've been working with the Conservation Commission for the last year on this project. So that 2018 comprehensive plan did recognize that the 2002, the last version of the comprehensive plan, had used some data that had been provided from the state and federal governments on floodplain data that was very outdated. And so the comprehensive plan that was adopted a couple of years ago recognized that floodplain mapping had to be updated in terms of the restrictions that the town places on properties within those areas. The town had already done that for aquifer protection. In 2011, the state produced some new sand and gravel aquifer maps, and another recommendation of this update to the comprehensive plan said that the aquifer protection districts that were in place needed to be revised to match the latest state data, and that was already done as part of the first implementation of this comprehensive plan. So now we're looking at the Resource Protection District, and that's all these areas in gray. And if you look at the 2002, this is the floodplain map from the 2002 comprehensive plan that was done by the AVCOG, Androscoggin Valley Council of Governments. And so they had pretty extensive floodplains along most of the waterways of the town, particularly along the Androscoggin River. And so if you look at the current zoning map, you see that the Resource Protection District is almost a mirror image of that floodplain mapping. And again, I'll just go back and you can kind of see how the current Resource Protection District is mostly defined by the 2002 floodplain mapping. So, as I mentioned, the new aquifer maps, well, this is the new, what they call LIDAR. It's, I think it's done with satellite and infrared. And basically, you can actually pick up gravel pits. That's how detailed this stuff is in terms of comparison with what they were doing before. So based on that, all the green on here is what FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, that does floodplain mapping. This is their most recent mapping indicating what the floodplains in Durham are. So you can see it's quite a bit less land area that was included that should be considered as resource protection based on floodplain sensitivity. So, we had proposed a two-phase process for realigning the Resource Protection District. The first phase of this would be to remove areas that are not floodplain, that are mapped as resource protection because of floodplain. So the light gray on this area, as you can see, the darker gray more aligns with the latest FEMA floodplain mapping. But in moving forward with removing areas out of the Resource Protection District, the new comprehensive plan also recommends not just removing those areas, but considering additional criteria, which would include all areas covered by state shoreland zoning, the land within 100 feet of the major streams, which is currently in resource protection, and then also wetlands of 10 or more acres, and then finally, there are some, and Joe is the expert on this aspect of this project, which is inland waterfowl and wading bird habitats. His department has identified some of those areas in Durham that are high quality habitat for waterfowl and wading bird breeding. So the beginning with habitat program from the state, made recommendations on preserving buffers around those areas. And then finally, there are also areas where you have floodplain and stream buffer and wading bird habitat and other natural resources that are all in the same location. And the state has identified some of those multiple resource areas and developed a rating system. It's like 1 to 15 or 16 or something like that. And so when the comprehensive plan was adopted, it basically said anything with 6 or more of those overlapping values should be considered for resource protection or mandatory cluster if somebody was doing a subdivision in that. So in deciding what to recommend for removal, if land that's there now meets any of those criteria, it would still be retained and not be removed. So it would only be the floodplain areas that are improperly mapped that would be removed as part of phase 1, with the premise that this is just basically correcting bad data and taking improper restrictions off people's properties based on faulty data. So then phase 2 would then look at areas outside of the existing resource protection, and those are shown here in green just to kind of make them stand out. So these are areas that meet those criteria that are in the comprehensive plan. And there's a public participation process that we're engaged in here tonight to look at these areas in detail, look at the principles behind it, look at the potential impacts, the potential benefits, and try to make policy decisions to put before the voters at town meeting. So this would be the resultant resource protection district that would include the areas removed in phase 1 and the areas added in phase 2 of this project, and that would be the resultant map that more accurately tracks the actual natural resources provided on the basis of the state provided data. So again, we had proposed to do phase 1 at the last town meeting back in April, and there was criticism at the town meeting of the idea of doing these as 2 separate phases, and so the voters actually did not approve phase 1, and there was an expectation that if this was going to be considered, it needed to be considered in tandem, if not a single vote, at least having 2 separate votes on the same town meeting warrant. And so that's the track that this is on right now. The select board has reviewed this, and they're pretty set that they're in the principle that there are 2 different issues here. One issue is people that have land that's currently restricted based on bad data, and then there's another set of property owners, and all of which we've attempted to notify. We sent out, I think it was 440 postcards like the ones you received to anyone whose land was touching any of those areas that I've identified. And so the select board is pretty firmly of the position, and Kevin Nadeau is here tonight. He can echo or correct my understanding. They think that these are 2 completely separate different issues and should be considered separately. So the plan right now is to have 2 different questions on the town meeting warrant for April of 2023. One would say, revise the zoning map to remove those areas from, that were improperly mapped. And then part 2 or phase 2 would be to have a separate question to add new areas to the resource protection. So I have developed a GIS system for the town, which is how I prepared all of these maps, using that state data as well as some the local town property maps and things. And so I've already been contacted by several property owners asking for detailed information. And I'm just going to show you an example of what we can provide to people so that you can understand what the impact of this might be on your property. So here is an example of one property, I think it's on Auburn Pownell Road. And so this property owner contacted me to say, you know, what's going on, because they saw a lot of green on the map in their particular area. And so I'm able to zoom in, highlight their property, and then show, here's the gray is the existing, phase 1 will remove this part, and then phase 2, probably one of the most impacted properties I've seen on this project. So what I can do is go through the individual layers of those different criteria and add sequentially. This is the beginning with habitat 10-acre wetlands. So these are areas that are low, wet, lots of wetland area. Now there can be pockets, like this one shows here, of upland within that large area, and there's probably a lot more. But based on aerial photography and soils maps, they have a pretty good idea that if you go out there, these are pretty wet areas. And so that's one of the criteria. Then we could add onto that, the beginning with habitat, recommends buffers around those wetlands. So that also would be included based on the criteria. And then we can end up with a composite. Here's another property where someone contacted me. This is over off Bowie Hill Road. And so phase 1 removes this area from the resource protection based on the more accurate floodplain mapping. And then phase 2, based on the other criteria, adds a little bit to that. So there's a net reduction. I think I calculated about 4 or 5 acres. So I can do this on anyone's property. If you are interested to see what the details would be, I've done a few more on the sign-up sheet that you came in. If you would like to have me take a look at your property, I mean, we sent out 440 notices, so obviously I have to be able to, and it takes me about an hour to do each one of these, half an hour to an hour, depending on what the situation is. But I'm more than happy to do it, and at least you have the information that you need to understand what the impact potentially could be on your property, either positive or negative. So I do have maps, townwide maps of all the individual layers. Here's another property. This one was actually, the other property with the big impact was here. This is the abutter who heard about what this was doing. And so they were questioning, you know, what does that look like on my property? We bush hog the field, you know, and so I could actually overlay an air photo which shows the field, and you can see that the buffer around the wetland area pretty much follows the tree line, and so it wouldn't be affecting their fields. But those are the types of questions that people really want to know. And the town, thankfully, is in the position with all the research we've done to be able to at least answer these questions. And I do have all of the individual layers. This is another one that I just got done. As you can see, the floodplain and what the impact would be, which is not much. And it's basically, these are floodplain areas if they're being added, or other resource areas, but particularly the floodplains. It's not a good place to build a house or do development anyway. So I do have all the individual layers, but I just kept that as background. I won't go through those. So that's pretty much my explanation, and I'd be happy to help the Conservation Commission, you all, as much as I can.
Yeah.
I'm Bill Simon on Sackville, and I apologize for my ignorance. It doesn't affect me as it affects others. I just put them out of curiosity. But I remember attending a similar meeting like this prior to last spring's town meeting. And I'm not understanding what's the difference of the meeting we attended to prior to last town meeting and tonight's meeting.
Yeah, that's a good question. So tonight's meeting is being hosted by I saw you came a couple seconds after we said this earlier. It's being hosted by the Conservation Commission on behalf of the Planning Board, and this is more of an informational meeting to help people answer questions like, what is resource protection? what does that mean for my property, you know, and ask any other sort of questions from there. This is being done in addition to another meeting that will happen with the planning board in the beginning of next year prior to the town meeting to say this is the exact warrant language and this is how it's going to be presented in April at the town meeting to be voted on then. So this is, just since it didn't go through last time, there seemed to be a lot of questions that were popping up at the town meeting. We figured this is a good opportunity to answer those questions and kind of get ahead of it and make sure that people have a really solid understanding of the impacts and of the changes before the next meeting and then the subsequent meeting where we vote on it in April. So, does that answer your question at all? Yeah? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Jane Rice, I live on Bowie Hill, one of those properties was mine.
Mhm.
I guess I'm a little frustrated. I went to the town meeting, I think people heard loud and clear, we don't think it's right that this should be done in two different pieces, and that's why it was voted down. I'm not sure who didn't hear that, but I listened to the select board meetings the other day, I listened to them, and basically what I heard was, Kevin felt that it was two different issues. I guess my question number one would be, is the data, what I believed at the town meeting was that we were doing phase one because it took so much time that we only had time to deal with phase one. We didn't have the hours in to present phase two, and that's why it was two separate issues. That's what I heard. Now I'm hearing that phase one is based on data, scientific data. Is phase two based on scientific data, or are we just
Mhm.
winging that?
No, so that's a good question. First off, foremost, in terms of warrant language, as a conservation commission, we do not write warrant language.
I get
We do
that.
not change warrant language. We're just here to present the information that the select board has asked the planning board to ask us to present. So that's a separate issue, and we don't write language, so we're just here as on a
I'm not
fact-finding
pointing
mission.
fingers,
No worries, no, I
I'm
know
just
you know.
trying to
And in
see-
terms of
understand.
the criteria, George, if you could go back to the slide that shows all that. Yes, all of this criteria is based in different data layers that are developed by a variety of different state and federal agencies. So, for example, you know, the 100-year floodplain is really easy for most of us to imagine. That's the expected floodplain of a 100-year storm event that could take place. Like George said, that data is different now than it was in the past because of the technology LiDAR that he was talking about has not been around for a terribly long time, and it's essentially like it can take images and do measurements from drones or from the planes or from satellites to get really detailed information. I mean, some LiDAR can tell you the height of trees in the species. It's very different than it used to be. The shoreline zoning is a state level recommended or requirement in many cases of what your property has to look like to be in compliance with DEP, Maine DEP. The lands within 100 feet of major perennial streams, that's a buffer that is recommended by the Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife. Usually with a forested landscape, a buffer of 75 foot is what's required by like the Maine Department of Maine Forest Service, is where you can't do any impact. IF&W, Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife, recommends considering extending that buffer to 100 feet and in some cases out to 300 feet. So that's something that we've already done a long time here in Durham, extended that out to 100 feet, just because it does provide a lot more habitat value for a lot of wildlife species. About 86% of wildlife species utilize those corridors here in the state of Maine, so that's kind of the nexus for that value. The forest and emergent wetlands, that is being added in again, these are all recommendations from the comprehensive plan, not us, we're just explaining them. So that is being added in because those are considered wetlands of very high value. Forested wetlands generally are very productive for fish and wildlife. They help control stormwater, they help control nutrients, they kind of act as buffers and sponges and pull a lot of toxins out of our water, which is, I know, a very important value to all of us. Rural, to me, means when you look at aerial footage, there's more green space than there is tar and buildings, and that captures some of that as well. And then lands within 250 foot of wading bird and waterfowl habitat. There's a designation of certain wetlands as inland wading bird and waterfowl habitat. That means that these areas are very highly productive for our waterfowl, our ducks, our other species that you might think of are like great blue herons and stuff like that. Those habitats are very much in decline. They have been filled in a lot by developments in the past and before these sorts of regulations have gone through. And once they're gone, you don't get them back. So that they provide a lot of great value, and they're also wetlands. So generally speaking, in today's day and age, when you have dealing with permitting and wetland fill, you're not going to be able to build in those anyways. But they provide a lot of good wildlife resources. And then the beginning with habitat, 6+ co-occurring resources is another scientifically based model essentially. So the state has mapped all important wildlife and habitat features, and they assign each feature a score, whether it's like 1, 2, 3, or 4. Now where those scores overlap tells you that there are a lot of co-occurring important habitat and wildlife and water quality features. So oftentimes that overlapping takes place where there is an inland wading bird and waterfowl habitat, but also a stream and also a rare occurrence of a rare species. So things that are kind of blinking out as development and stuff like that takes place. So all of these are rooted in data that's provided by a lot of,
Scientific data.
yeah, it's all scientific data provided mostly by the Maine Department of Environmental Protection and the Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife.
Okay, so I wanted to hear that come out of your mouth, because that means that it would be okay to do it all at once, because it's all scientifically driven. It is not, let's take land out of resource protection, and I'm gonna shoot myself in the foot, because I could be taken out of some of resource protection. However, if they overlay the other map, then I'm gonna get some put back in. So, I just think what's fair in the town is if you're gonna go by scientific data, you do it all at once and not say, let's pull stuff out, and then the next vote, people don't wanna get put in, so they're gonna vote it down. And then our town is more open to more development than it currently is now. And it's getting pretty scary out there, what's happening. So, anyway, I wanted it loud and clear. I think one vote, and I'm not sure what the select board did or did not hear, but Kevin, when you said I felt like it was unethical for us not to do it this way, I think it's unethical not to put it all together if it's based on scientific data.
You had your hand up next?
Can I address that?
Sure.
My name's Kevin Neto, I'm a member of the Board of Selection. And, you know, I don't think the message that we necessarily took from town meeting was that it should all be one question. I think the message we took is that we should be voting on it at the same meeting. And the board does feel very strongly, with the integrity of the process, that it is two very separate questions. The first part about land that let's step back. This is about making sure that our land map accurately reflects the real world conditions on the ground. Okay, because what we don't want is somebody to have to goes into the code enforcement office and says, I'd like to do X, Y, and Z on my land, and the code enforcement officer looks at the map and says, oh, well, your land is in resource protection, so you can't do what you're saying you want to do. But there's a significant amount of land in the town that is misidentified as being in resource protection that it shouldn't be. So the way we look at it is, the first question is very objective, right? We have a map that inaccurately represents what the 100-year floodplain is, and as a result, people have land under restrictions that they shouldn't be under. So we want to correct that so that the people aren't being penalized by a mistaken map. Okay, we see that as a separate question from what should be added to resource protection, because that question is much more subjective, right? Because it's based upon the criteria, and the criteria we use or don't use, that's where like public input comes in. Like for instance, you know, there's probably a couple things here that are legal requirements, like state shoreline zoning, and probably the FEMA 100-year flood plan. But some of it is subjective, like the 6 criteria for under the habitat conditions. Is 6 the right number? Maybe it's 4. Maybe it's 8. That's something that could be discussed. but it's an objective thing, so, that's why we wanna, vote on it separately. We didn't feel it's fair if you lump them in one question, and as you say, maybe there is a sentiment out there that people don't want to add more land to resource protection. If it's all one question, then the people whose land is misidentified, their land doesn't come out and they continue to be penalized. So that's why it's two questions. The first one is to correct the mistake on the map, like basically to correct the past mistake. The second question is about, okay, what do we want resource protection to look like in the future?
So can you tell me, are these other layers, I thought they were being mandated by the state.
So a lot of this is from our 2018 comprehensive plan. And one note on the data layer, the old floodplain data versus this floodplain, I have a slightly different interpretation than Kevin on that data layer. That is a reflection of what the town felt was important to protect back then. Now, these set of criteria are what the town feels is important to correct now. So a town can put anything they want in resource protection for whatever reason. They could say because we think that this is old growth forest, or because we think that we want 500 feet around the stream. So that data layer at the time was something that people were comfortable with, and now we're proposing to adopt these 6 new criteria, which includes utilizing the most recent floodplain data. So I wouldn't necessarily consider it a mislabeling, it's just a changing in town values, which would pull some town information, some properties out, and would put some town properties in. And that is kind of subject to individual viewpoints on that for sure. But these other layers, not all of them are required by the state. Like, for example, shoreline zoning is one that is required by the state, but the rest are from the 2018 comprehensive plan. You had your hand up next.
So I'm confused about how much of this is mandated by the state and the feds, and what the difference would be. If this doesn't get enacted, part 2, the new stuff, isn't it automatically protected by state and federal requirements?
Can I answer
Yeah,
that one?
that's-
Okay, so my initial charge from the planning board was to hire Mike Morse, who used to be the shoreline zoning coordinator for DEP for this region. And so the first thing we did was to look at what is required to be resource protection under state law. And virtually the only parts of Durham that are required to be resource protection are the Androscoggin River, where you have either floodplain or steep slope areas. And Mike Morse did an analysis and showed that virtually the whole frontage along the river is required to be resource protection. The other main area is around Runaround Pond. And under DEP shoreline zoning rules, if you have an area like Joe talked about, large wetland areas, forested wetlands, if you have 2 or more acres of that on the edge within 250 feet of Runaround Pond, that also has to be resource protection. And it's in different places around it, but it's about half of the whole frontage of Runaround Pond. And the only other areas in the town where you're required by state law to have resource protection is some of the emergent wetlands, some of the farm fields we had to add into shoreline zoning. Again, if those have some floodplain margin or forested wetland within 250 feet of them, and those are just kind of a few spots around, but the main areas where it's required by state law to be resource protection is along the Androscoggin River and around Runaround Pond, about half of that frontage. The rest of it is all subject to the local decision-making process.
So how much land that's not being what's the percentage of land that's not mandated that's being protected?
We haven't done that calculation because from the Conservation Commission side of things, we're just here to answer the questions on what the town voted on in 2018 comprehensive plan. So we are just here to explain what the 6 criteria that they picked, that the town picked out and voted on, and what those implications are. We haven't gone through to calculate, what if there's a net increase or a net decrease. If you're looking at the map and just making that visual adjustment, it seems to be about the same, just shifting a little bit. But since we're thinking about this from a scientific standpoint, where we're just considering the criteria, and from a policy standpoint, the criteria that the town already selected, we're not trying to calculate those sorts of things because that's not part of what we were tasked with doing. So, yeah.
Could you clarify something? So what I think I heard you say is that the 100-year floodplain outside of the Androscoggin River directly is not required to be in resource protection.
That's correct.
Yeah.
A lot of towns, if you think about it, part of the reason
Is it required to be prohibited from development
No.
in some other ordinance?
I believe some mortgage companies will require you to get flood insurance.
Yeah,
if
that's the
you're
issue,
developing.
the FEMA has floodplain
So within the
regulations.
town ordinances, there's no ordinance that says you.
No, and no state law says it has to be
Yeah.
resource protection.
Yeah, because I don't believe the initial map that shows all of it is considered floodplain. It's considered, that initial map for resource protection also mentions things like swampy areas as designated on the map. So that initial map isn't just showing floodplains or what was necessarily a floodplain map. It just happens to align a lot with those water resources, which is very common.
Well, you had a map that was a 100-year.
Yeah, we have a new map, new data that
Right.
shows what a 100-year is, and that is listed as one of the criteria that the 2018 comp plan asked to be used for consideration.
That was
So-
the mapping in 2002.
Right.
Can you define 100-year floodplain? What does that mean?
So generally, when you probably have heard of things like 100-year storm, 500-year storm, that's referring to where if you think of 100 years of flooding, 100 years of weather, 100 years of fluctuation, that area would capture all of the possible projected areas that water should move into. So
By flooding, what would flooding look like?
usually flooding would be defined as when the water from a river or a stream leaves its defined channel. So you have a defined bed and bank. When the water comes up and over that, goes into the adjacent fields, adjacent woods, that's when you kind of get into a flooding situation. And floodplain data can change based off of if a new dam is put in or if some sort of new management of the waterway is put in. Now you have different floodplains. If you think about like on River Road there's water fluctuates pretty regularly and in the past has come up and over. So. Go ahead. Yeah?
Part two. I guess that the reason I'm concerned about this is that when we purchased our land, we were aware of some of the restrictions, because of streams and stuff like that. Looking at this new map, it's like our whole property is like now green. So
Yeah.
it's no longer residential zoning, agricultural zoning, it's now all resource protection. On top of it, it's like a level 6, it's got everything. And I'm like, are you serious?
Mhm.
It doesn't flood. The only thing I see around there is turkeys, I don't think there's too many endangered birds living in our hayfield, so I'm sort of like, where does this notion come from that this huge, pretty big piece of property is all of a sudden gonna be rezoned?
Yeah, so part of that is the beginning with habitat data. For example, you manage hayfields. There are certain species that are endangered in the state that specialize on hayfields, specialize on those sorts of things. But that being said, resource protection doesn't prevent you from agriculture, doesn't prevent you from cutting those fields, doesn't prevent you from grazing wild animals, doesn't prevent you from haying them. So it doesn't prevent that. But those things that you're talking about is why you might not have seen it flood. It is a 100-year period to think about. So for most of us, that spans more than a lifetime. So it has the potential based off of the topography and the location in adjacent water bodies. The soil types play a big role. Some soil is very well drained and the water's just going to go through there like our sands. Other soil is clay and it's going to hold water, so you have potential to flood more. So there's more than what you just see necessarily on the surface, and all of it is collected data that's been analyzed by a variety of state agencies and federal agencies.
I guess another question I would have for folks who are sort of in my shoes, where all of a sudden, the whole McGill almost has been turned into agriculture, is that what happens to, homeowners that maybe my son and daughter wanted to build a little cabin someplace on that property, no longer can do that because it's in reserve. So the land, in my view, is where you're sort of paying taxes, for a residential piece of property. Now the town, whoever decided, okay, we're gonna take that away from you, now it's just gonna be resource protection. I'm not interested in developing the property. It's like, okay, so am I still paying taxes on this, or is there some sort of way of looking at a homeowner and say, well, you're getting screwed,
So if your land is in resource protection, you can have conversations with the town assessor and the code enforcement officer on a case-by-case basis, because if you are losing developmental potential, it can sometimes equate to decreased taxes. That is a discussion that we don't have because we're not here as tax experts. That's something I would encourage you to ask the town assessor and the code enforcement officer about. That's done case by case.
It just seems like, almost like an eminent domain kind of a situation. You say, well, you thought you had something, now it's being taken away.
Yeah,
You know,
and that's the
in some
key.
cases, I would say not necessarily reasonable. I mean, look at that map with those little green pixels on it. I say, seriously? You know, where, you know, does that actually go? And I will ask you, you know, you offered about that.
Yeah,
So-
and so that's what this whole process is for. With any sort of change, there are people who are gonna have an associated loss or a gain. So that's why we're having this public process, and that's why we're increasing the amount of public hearings we're having versus last time. So people really understand those implications, so we're answering those questions now and raising those concerns now, rather than at town meeting, where the vote is happening right away. So it gives people the opportunity to really see the impacts on their property prior and bring up points like what you're bringing up. So, like you said, you know, you might not be interested in developing, but it certainly, with resource protection, the major limitation is buildings or energy development like solar or wind or subdivisions. There's definitely some, it prevents, you know, the footprint of buildings and stuff like that. So that's the concern. It sounds like you're sharing.
Well, more or less.
Yeah.
The quick question is that you have one of the maps, the sort of yellow areas, I guess, on the website, where proposal is to take out of
Correct.
resource
Yeah.
protection. So I'm looking at this and I say, okay, so that corner of my land is yellow. Okay, that's been taken out. Look at another map and it's all green again.
Mhm.
You know, it just seems like a contradiction.
Well, what I mentioned earlier was that in removing any areas, if those areas still had any of these other criteria, and it was the floodplain that was being removed, but if they still met these other criteria, we would not remove it.
Right.
So basically what happened was part of your land was yellow
Yeah,
based on floodplain that wasn't floodplain,
right.
but then there were other values that also were on that property.
Oh.
So that was why
That's green again.
Yeah, so that's where a little bit of confusion on the two-phase system is. That first phase is saying, let's address just the floodplain, but if your property also has those occurrences and it was already mapped as resource protection, the first phase doesn't pull those out. It keeps them in. So that's where the confusion could come with the map, for sure. So, Heather, you had a question?
I have a couple questions and a couple comments. I don't have my comp plan with me to refer to, so what the 2018 voter approved comp plan listed what criteria?
These 6 right here.
No, I mean, like, you know how it was when we did this last time, I was asking, I think the maps were drawn at a level 4 criteria?
Yeah, sorry, let me explain that. Are you talking about with the beginning with habitat co-occurrence?
I think
Yeah, so the comprehensive plan recommends beginning with habitat co-occurrence model data of 6 or more and including that as resource protection. It also made a recommendation on creating critical rural areas for areas that are 4 or more. We're not discussing that, and I don't know if there's been any discussion about that. But this is saying 6 or more because that 6 value is significant in the sense that the Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife has said that that is where those habitats start showing a lot of really important features, and at 6 is kind of that threshold where, okay, now this is something you should consider protecting for its conservation value.
And the comp plan says 6 or more.
Yep, 6
So-
or more in relation to resource protection.
So it's not really a subjective conversation. This mapping was specifically done based on what people voted on and approved in 2018.
Yeah, the map George has made right here is a picture of exactly what it would look like if all of the recommendations from the 2018 comp plan were adopted. That is what this map would look like.
Okay.
That's if both phases were voted on and went through, this is what the map would be.
Okay, so just to be really clear, when Kevin was speaking earlier, he was saying that the floodplain is based, and the reason why the select board is choosing to take this route is because the phase 1 removing just the outdated floodplain information, and then these other things are subjective. That it's not really subjective if we're going based on the 2018 voter approved comp plan. correct? We're not talking about 4 or 6. Well,
Yeah,
we're talking
I
about
would
6
say
or
that-
8 or 10.
In the sense that, is it something that is already been asked for by the folks who voted on the comprehensive plan? Yeah, this is very clearly an exact representation of those 6 different criteria, which includes the beginning with habitat, the inland wading bird and waterfowl habitat, the 10 acres, the 100-foot stream buffer, and the shoreline zoning, and a new up-to-date floodplain map, so yeah.
Okay, thank you for
Kevin,
clarifying.
So Heather's right in terms of this is representing what's in the, I know she's shocked.
I actually am. Everybody write it down in the record book. Holy crap.
But you have to say that the comp plan, it should absolutely guide and inform the process. That's the purpose of it. But it's not a to-the-letter legally binding document. So, and things evolve and comp plans can be amended. So if people think that at some point that, you know, something articulated in the comprehensive plan should be changed, then that can be changed, you know, but again, that you go through that process, the public vetting process. And so, what I really stood up for was, I wanna clarify what the first question is going to do. Because I think, let me start by what it's not going to do. It's not going to only remove property that is not in the updated 100-year floodplain, and then in the next question, some of it may get added back in. Question 1 will be to remove from resource protection any property that doesn't meet any of the criteria, not one. And that's what we're talking about pulling out of resource protection. Not in the 100-year floodplain, and it doesn't meet any of those other criteria. That's the first question that we will seek to do. So we're not going to take it out in question 1 and put it back in question 2, okay?
So then my question
I have a question,
okay.
clarification, because originally you had said that first phase was to align us with the 100-year floodplain,
Well,
but it actually is to align us with the 100-year floodplain and adopt these criteria for some landowners, but not all landowners.
If you're
Yeah.
Right,
And
so
then-
in the
and
first,
the
if
reason
the
I
first
made that
phase goes
statement,
through, you
Joe,
end up,
is
you
the
get some people who are being, with these 6 criteria applied, and some people who don't have them applied on their property, correct?
What do you mean by apply? Well, the criteria are criteria,
Yeah.
so what we're talking about is, if there's property in the town that doesn't meet any of those criteria, then it should not be identified as resource protection. But currently, the map that we have does identify some property that doesn't meet any of those conditions as being in resource protection. So the first question is to remove those properties or pieces of properties from the map as being shown resource protection. And then it's a discussion of the criteria, and what the criteria is that if there's anything that does meet some of those criteria and is not currently shown on the map as resource protection, question 2 asks to add those properties to resource protection.
Right, but I just want to clarify, section 1 doesn't simply just align with the 100-year floodplain.
Correct.
Right, and that, I think there might have been a statement about that earlier, so I just want to clarify. It's not just saying 100-year floodplain.
It's not just about the.
Wait,
If I
I
can hand
wasn't
it-
even
oh,
close
sorry.
to done. I wasn't even close to done. My time got hijacked. Okay, so back to, thank you, that was all really informative. So it sounds like question 1 is going to apply this criteria to remove property. And then question 2 is going to apply this criteria to so this is a statement, not a question. I feel really confused about why that wouldn't just be one statement. Does the town of Durham wish to apply the criteria to all property in Durham? Why, I feel confused about why that's not the question, which is what I believe, based on all of the meetings that I attended, all of the public comment that I heard, was the reason that it was voted down last year, and why people want to see it presented that way, so that all landowners are subject to the same criteria across the board. One thing that I would really like to clarify, because I feel like I keep hearing it, is that the data that has the land marked as resource protection currently is bad or inaccurate data. And I would prefer, if this is in fact the case, which based on what I'm hearing, it sounds like, is that this data is now outdated. That at the time that we used that data, it was current and accurate data. And now that data has become outdated.
So the way I think of it is that the town's values have changed, and that this new data better represents the existing town values as voted on in 2018. Because that old data, like I said, any people can include, just large tracts of land or fields over 50 acres or whatever they want as resource protection and vote on it, and the voters can decide. The town, in their review process in 2018, decided that the original resource protection doesn't represent the town's values now, so they're looking to change it. So I think that using the words bad data, good data are a little
Inaccurate.
confusing,
Yeah.
because it's just more, I see it more as a reflection of the changing town values, and including different information, so.
And much more precise data.
Yeah,
and mapping
LiDAR didn't
technology.
exist when this was originally drawn out. I think the town original map says something of like swamps as outlined on this property. So a lot of times municipalities just kind of gobbled up water resources and wetlands as their protected areas. And I think that that's originally what that first data layer represents, or was trying to represent, so. You've had your hand up a couple times now, so.
Michelle Richardson, I live over in Patriot Way. One quick question, if I got a postcard, does that mean I'm impacted, or does that go to everybody?
No, that only went to those of us who own property that is either currently in resource protection
Or might go?
or might go into resource protection. So this is like, if there's a change and now that your back corner is touched by resource protection, you got this. You could be someone who's having your land taken out of resource protection, you got this. So this is just anyone who's gonna have any of that little fluctuation occur on their property.
Okay, so, thank you for that clarification. So my comment is around 1 versus 2 questions. So my understanding, and it's sort of evolving as I've listened today, my fear is that I was in favor of 2 questions, because I do not think we should penalize people whose property should not be in, if you were, the FEMA 100-year floodplain is not decided by anyone in this room. That's decided by FEMA. Just like every mortgage you've ever gotten on your house is gonna have flood insurance if you're in the floodplain. And there's lifelong review of that. So as floodplains are updated, you may find out your house is now in a floodplain, you're gonna have to get flood insurance on it. And vice versa, if it comes out, you would wanna get that flood insurance off your property because it's expensive, right? So I am 100% in favor of removing the resource protection on properties that are no longer in the floodplain. And my understanding was that was question 1. But the clarification around no longer in the floodplain and doesn't meet any of these criteria, for me is a little concerning, because where I see there being an issue is if that's the case, question 1 passes, question 2 fails, then those people have these 6 criteria applied to their properties and no one else does. In my mind, that's not overly fair. So I think question 1 should be straight floodplain, regardless of these, right? And then question 2 is, are these the 6 criteria that we as a community feel is important on what we want to protect? So I'm in favor of 2 questions because I don't want to penalize people that shouldn't be, but I also don't want to penalize them by instituting other restrictions that other people don't have.
So thank you for sharing that. We don't write the
I
questions.
understand, but there are people in the room.
Kevin and the select board do,
It wouldn't,
so.
it wouldn't apply the criteria there, it doesn't meet any criteria, those or any other that anybody has come up with so far.
But so some of these 6 are new, right? Like, that's why we're adding things in. So these 6 new ones, if I'm no longer in a floodplain, but I'm now in this, 6 habitat figure, right? Which previously wouldn't be in resource protection, would my property come out?
It would come out, so.
Your property will only come out if there's no occurrences. So
Right.
if you are,
Right, so right now,
Yeah.
that's not a requirement.
right, if you are, like, your understanding is correct. If you are here and we're saying phase 1 goes through, okay, you're no longer in the floodplain, but you still are within a wetland of 10 or more acres, your property would not be removed in phase one.
And then question
So,
2 fails, and
phase
now mine
one
is, and you know that somebody
removes-
else isn't.
Phase one is saying, here's our massive resource protection map.
Yep.
And anything that meets nothing outlined under the new criteria comes out. So you would then have the new criteria applied to your property if that was occurring there in phase one. And then phase two is saying, okay, for all the other areas where this should apply, but we're not applying right now, let's vote to add it in.
Do you
So
understand the
you
distinction of why my
fully,
concern is?
you fully, yeah, I understand what you're saying, and you're fully understanding it correctly,
Okay,
yes.
just wanna make
But
sure.
we don't write the warrant language, we're just here to have these discussions on clarification and talk about what it means. And we haven't even really talked about exactly what resource protection means, but we're just kind of showing you what the maps are.
Yeah, I think
So
2
I'm
questions are
getting
changed
that
the first
point
one.
though, I understand what you're saying, I think about floodplain versus all the criteria. So
Yep.
I think that's why we're having these discussions.
Well, I was under the impression the warrants were already written based off of the November 8th
No,
meeting. You
no.
said we're not really taking public.
No, it's just a
comment
Kevin's
on
No, that's
question.
a mischaracterization.
Just another factor to consider.
You said you
in
didn't
this.
care what a survey said, your language was gonna do it in 2 phases on November
Two
8th.
separate votes.
Yeah, so I was under the impression that we were talking about what this means and not warrant language.
The board is, as of right now, the board is pretty much unanimously, on there's 2 separate questions about taking stuff out and adding stuff in. But
So
the
what-
questions themselves,
So you're saying you will consider changing the language of the questions as long as it remains 2 questions? But you wouldn't combine
it could be, and maybe it's not 2 questions. And I've actually been sitting here thinking, maybe it's 6 questions.
Great, which ones are important?
Maybe,
that you
yeah,
might add?
exactly, maybe it's one question about, do we wanna take stuff out of resource protection that doesn't meet any of the criteria or the floodplain or
The
wherever
current
we
criteria,
leave, the
what's in
current
place
criteria,
today?
right. And then you ask maybe, and I don't know, you ask individually, does the town want to add to resource protection those lands in the 100-year floodplain? That is one question. Next one, does the town want to add mandatory shoreline zoning to, and so on down the list? Because it might be, maybe it's not an all or none thing, maybe people are good with parts of it, but not good.
So
with
isn't this
other
what we
parts
kinda already did with the comprehensive plan, when everyone voted to accept those 6
of it.
criteria?
Yeah, but ultimately,
know what it is.
ultimately, any comprehensive plan that's the starting point for, you bring proposals to the town, so you're meeting the obligation of the comp plan, but the town ultimately has to vote on it. So passing a comprehensive plan does not have the power of ordinance, only voting on an actual ordinance has that power.
It is in state statute though, that ordinance changing has to align with the comprehensive plan.
That's true, it does have to.
Oh my God, twice in one night.
But it doesn't mean it has to match it exactly.
You had your hand up a minute ago.
I have several questions,
Yeah.
actually. I agree with Kevin on the comprehensive plan, because it is just a tool for the town, for their ordinances. The beginning with Habitat Maps as a tool for the planning department. So none of that is set in stone, none of it is required, I agree with that. I wanna know where you have green, and you have 3 different criteria that are green, which one is my property in? Are they only green in
Yeah, that's-
all 6 criteria?
That's something you'd have to definitely ask George in, because
Remember I showed you some detailed analysis of different properties?
Yeah.
Give
I
me your,
happen to have been one of them.
oh, you are, which property?
Auburn Powell Road.
Okay.
And you said it was the 250 feet. Is that the only thing?
Yeah, because you raise a good point. Some people's properties may have overlapping
Well, you've said that
characteristics,
several times.
and others might not. They might only have one.
Is that your property
That's
right
my
there?
property.
Okay, yeah. It is this border of this large wetland area, the buffer around it. That's the only criterion. It just comes on the edge of your property along
Well,
the.
how far on the edge? If you have GIS.
Pretty much follows the tree line.
Yeah.
That green extends out beyond the tree.
Yeah, and that's because of those pixels.
Yeah, right here.
It's called raster
Can you,
data.
I asked if you could measure that for me and give me a scale of footage of impact.
Yeah, and I think I told you it was about 250 feet from this edge of this
No,
wetland.
you just said that was the requirement of the buffer. The
Yeah, and that's what
250 feet.
defines that resource protection
Right,
area, is that
but
buffer
that
requirement.
defines the buffer of the resource protection, but it doesn't define how much of my property is in that 250 foot buffer.
Yeah, so that
See
would
what I'm
involve a
saying?
survey on your property. So it's 250-foot buffer on that resource. Wherever your property line falls,
But I'm asking George, he
I
just
can
told
give you
us
an estimate.
that you have GIS capability and you can
Yes.
scale it. I don't have that
Yeah,
capability.
and I offer to do that.
No, you told me You sent me the map and said you were very busy preparing for the meetings.
That was true at that time.
So,
But
was my-
I'm
that was
saying
my-
tonight, I have
agree.
more time
I'm just
after this
asking that
meeting.
question. I also did not get a postcard.
Hmm.
I was in town hall asking to meet with George and he wasn't in on the day they arrived. Why didn't I get a postcard?
I'm not sure, we
I get a
didn't send the
tax bill,
postcards,
no
that was from the town office.
My
I
other,
got two, maybe I got yours.
maybe, my other question is the abutter neighbor, Dan Fisher, who's
Mhm.
not here because he's in Connecticut.
Mhm.
His property is already very defined by, tax use programs. He's got it in tree growth, it's already defined with wetland, he's got it in farmland.
Mhm.
It's clearly gonna, it's wet down in that area, clearly.
Mhm.
So to put on a blanket resource protection criteria, when you know if somebody went to develop it, which he's not gonna develop,
Mhm.
I have no desire to develop, that's why I bought a big chunk of land. It would have to go through a wetland study, it would have to have IFNW. So it's almost a double unnecessary criteria.
Yeah, so the reason this is being proposed the way it is because it wouldn't really create a sense of equity if we went around to each landowner and said, we're only gonna put resource protection on you if you have plan A, B, or C versus this landowner who says, I already have a conservation easement. So there are people in town who have permanent conservation easements that prevent their town property from ever being
And it
developed.
also gives them a
that-
tax advantage.
Yeah, exactly. Just like tree growth tax program
This doesn't
does,
give me an
just like
advantage.
Mr. Fisher's program does.
Right.
Now, with something like this, like we said earlier, if you're feeling that it is impacting the nature of your property, you can talk with the town assessor and the code enforcement officer to see if that has any impact on your tax burden. But like with a property like this, one thing I wanted to point out, so for example, even if this were to extend into your field, resource protection does not disallow you from mowing. It does not you are still allowed to mow this field. You could still cut all of the trees for firewood and follow all normal forestry regulations. You could plant it with crops, you could graze your cattle, or you could put goats in the woods to graze under there, or finish your pigs under there on acorns. Like, there's nothing that limits that. The only thing this would be saying is, at this point, you couldn't put a solar panel, you can't put a wind turbine, you can't put a parking lot, and you can't put a Walmart or a home or
Why not a solar panel?
because it's energy development is not allowed in the resource protection district. So it's like extractive things like gravel extraction, you couldn't put a gravel pit there. But if you wanted to put a private road, you would have to get a permit. So that's what we have here is some of the common things you can and can't do in resource protection. And then in our land use ordinance, there's 2 pages of all things that you can and can't do. So I've printed off
The
again
other question
for
I have
copies.
regarding that land use, and I have a copy of it. It says you can't have an accessory dwelling,
A what?
an accessory dwelling.
Within the footprint of resource
That was my
protection.
question.
Yep. So that's one thing that a lot of people have asked, saying, hey, a corner of my property is now in resource protection. Does that mean the standards apply to all my property area? No. It only applies to the area with resource protection. So if you were to put an accessory building over here, no impact. If you were to try to put a condo right here, then that's when there would be a restriction, but only within the actual area. So not the whole property. Yeah?
I'm curious as to how, I looked at the map for the proposed expansion of the resource protection area, and there's some areas that is significantly increased, or the proposed increase. How did you come by the borders? How did you establish that on that?
Yeah, so that was just, if we can go back,
Yep,
George. We didn't establish any of that.
Well, somebody did.
That
Somebody
is just
drew
the
map.
6, these are just those criteria that were selected in the comprehensive plan. So this map just reflects where those are. So like there's areas like here where we're seeing increases, there's a lot of areas throughout here where we're seeing decreases, and that's just a reflection of the criteria
Well,
that were accepted.
excuse me, my question is, how did you establish the expansion borders of the new areas?
These areas are already mapped by a lot of our state agencies, so we just took that map and overlaid it.
No. I'm talking about the green area where you've proposed to expand it on different properties throughout the town.
Mhm.
There isn't, you've got an area that's, say, rural residential, and then you've expanded the resource protection area significantly into that area. How is that, how did you come by that? How did you establish that?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is the one that shows the areas that are not currently resource protection. And going back to that first issue of, phase one, take out what's improperly zoned based on old floodplain maps. The other properties that meet the other criteria are currently in resource protection. So the question becomes, do you pull those out as well as the ones based on, that's a slightly different question.
Okay, maybe you're still missing.
No, I'm going
Okay.
back to your question right now. So those areas that are green on this map are not currently resource protection.
Right.
Phase two would add those to
Correct.
that, but that's based on the overall mapping
Mm-hmm.
and what is not currently in resource
But
protection.
how were the borders established for that new?
Based on those state inventories.
What's that?
Based on the state inventory maps that were provided to the town.
Okay, so that's information that somebody could get if they requested it?
Oh,
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah, all of that information is publicly available. It's right on the Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife's
But I signed it,
habitat map.
I can also get it from
Yes,
Quantico.
I'll
Yeah.
give you a
And
detail.
so- And one thing I want to point out with this map right here is there have some folks that raise a little confusion about this map. So this map shows the existing resource protection and shows what phase two would add. This map does not show what phase one takes out. So this would be a map, this map is what it would look like if for some reason the town voted down phase one but voted in phase two. And we're here saying that, we should consider voting both of them through because we want to apply it equally. So it's unlikely that this map would ever look like this because, realistically, a lot of these areas are going to be removed if phase one is voted on. So we could definitely pull together a map that shows, which we already have on here, a map that shows what it would look like after both phases were voted on if they both passed, so.
My comment right now speaks directly to what you just said. I think that the Conservation Commission has been wrongfully tagged as trying to overstep their role. And I think, in my opinion, the Conservation Commission has the ultimate credibility in this conversation because they could have said, let's start with phase two and put everything in and then take out phase one. They're not asking for that. They're asking for the criteria to be applied equally across the board. And so I just ask people to really consider what the intent is by asking in two phases. Last year, phase one being voted down because people were not interested in removing, we already know, right, that they're not interested in removing phase one without phase two as part of it, because we had that opportunity last year and we voted it down. And now, here we are again, being asked to do the same thing, and so it's been said, well, if why are people so worried about it? If we voted it down last year, they'll just vote it down again, and if people really wanna add resource protection, then they'll do that. Well, that's true, but what is the intent, what is the actual reason, when we already know the answer to the first question, right? That potentially, like Jane was saying, leaves land to be more developable if we pull that land out, which I think it should be if it doesn't meet the criteria, because that's a decision based on science. But equally, all landowners should be subject to the same set of criteria. So I'm just asking people to really think critically about why things are playing out the way that they're playing out, and who benefits from things playing out the way that they're playing out.
Just one clarification, we're not asking anyone to vote on anything. The Conservation Commission, we're just here tonight to explain what this data layer is, what these data layers are, what the scientific justification is behind them, and what the implications for the town. So we're just trying to answer those questions. So we didn't write this, we're not trying to say vote one, vote two, don't vote one, or any sort of iteration in between, so. I don't think you were loving
No,
that
I wasn't.
accusation,
I mean,
but
I
just wanna
just,
make that
I really
clear.
feel like if in fact the Conservation Commission was just trying to establish as much resource protection as possible, you would be advocating for putting all the land in right? You're not advocating for that. You're advocating for the science to be applied evenly across the board.
Can I make a
Well, some of it's science and some of it seems to be optional, you know, as far as phase two.
Well, the science is solid. Whether you want to include the science or not is the option. But as the questions are proposed right now, phase two would include all of the 6 criteria, not just individual criteria. But the science is there. It's just whether you want to include that. So it's not really a subjective matter in terms of whether that is scientifically relevant. It's just whether you want to include that facet.
Can I make a
But-
quick comment to her conservation committee and your?
Sure, yeah.
I think people need to remember that you as a conservation committee are doing what you were tasked to do by the selectmen.
Well, by the planning board.
Planning board,
Yeah.
remember, they gave you a charge, they told you this is what we want you to do. To overview, look at it. And I think the question of 1 vote or 2 votes is not as important as understanding the total impacts of the town. And I think when it comes to a zoning map change, the clearer the vote can be, the better your zoning map is gonna appear. And if it's an ambiguous, let's do this, add 1 and 2 and all this grouped together, I liked Kevin's idea. Maybe it's 6 votes, because, maybe it's 6 warrants, because zoning maps are that important.
If we do 6, the Girl Scouts are going to need to bring more cookies. Because I ran out halfway through last time.
Just put in your order
Um,
early.
Juliet had her hand up first.
So this is obviously really important this year. Are we ready to vote on this year? What is the timeline that we need?
So my understanding of the timeline is that the Conservation Commission is hosting this event to have these very important discussions and hear from everybody. There's a member of the planning board here, there's a member from the select board here. This is just, and then we're being recorded. This is just a public information gathering. And then, per statute, the planning board has to have a meeting prior to the April meeting, town meeting, to go over all of this information again. But the planning board and the select board, I believe, and then members of the town, since there was so much confusion, we're just asking for this to be an additional fact gathering meeting, because there seem to be a lot of questions at the town meeting of like, what's this mean for me? What's this mean if we do this in the future? So this is just, I don't want to use phase because we're talking about phases, but this is act 1 of 3,
Right,
I
but we
would
don't
say.
really have that much time in theory. It's December. When does the warrants need to be like?
I think Kevin can answer that question.
Yeah, so basically, with any ordinance change, there needs to be a public hearing, and in this case, it does have to be hosted by the planning board. And I believe it needs to be at least 7 days before, but not more than 30 days before the vote. So, town meeting, so it means sometime in March. But
So I
it
think
would be the actual public hearing. And I think Joe alluded to this earlier, that this meeting is, and this was voiced at town meeting, like people wanted an opportunity to offer some input when there was still time to tweak things or change things. By the time we get to the public hearing, what our responsibility to present to the town is like, what are the actual warrant questions that are proposed to be voted on at the town meeting in April. Now, it could still be tweaked at that point. It's not common, but it could. Certainly not in a substantive, like major way. But I mean, there is opportunity to tweak something if we had to coming out of public hearing. But the purpose of this is to hear some things and try to get ahead of that, and where if things need to be worded differently, like the question 1 thing, I've heard some good arguments. I think we'll have to talk through with George, how do we word that to, make sure that we are applying the criteria equitably across the board, whichever way it ends up. And, I want to answer one more time the question that came up. I think it's, I've agreed with Heather twice tonight, but I don't disagree with her here. I think it's an opinion, not a fact, that on what she thinks the vote meant at the last town meeting. Different people will have different interpretations of what that meant and why they voted it down. I think a lot of people voted it down because Joe raised a technicality issue about who hosted the public hearing. I mean, he was right. It was hosted by the select board, and it was by law supposed to have been hosted by planning board. You know, I don't know if the end result would be any different, but he was right about that. So that and a few other things people raised, just raised enough doubt where people, you know, and we've seen, anybody who's been to town meeting a lot, you know that if the room is confused, the room is voting no, right? And so I think that's what happened. It wasn't by any means do we interpret that as a declarative, this is absolutely what the town said. We do not interpret that from that results of that vote. And the reason that it's 2 votes is very simple in the eyes of the board, is that we don't want to have people whose property should not be identified as resource protection have the only way that that can be corrected is to have other property put in resource protection. We want to remedy the people that shouldn't be in resource protection and then talk about, and fix that, and then talk about, what should be added.
So you're contradicting yourself though, because at the beginning of your statement, you said that you believed the criteria should be applied equitably across the board. And then what you just said right there is the exact
I
opposite of that.
don't think so. I think I said that, so what we wanna take out is, if it doesn't meet the criteria, then we wanna take it out. If it does meet the criteria, we wanna add it in. It's really
So
that
then
simple.
why is that not being asked that way? Why,
It will be
that's,
asked, it is being asked that way.
It's asked in 2 questions though.
Exactly,
But
that's why you
if
need
you put
two
it all
questions.
in one,
then it's equitable.
everybody's
If you
treated
put it
the
on,
same
the
way.
criteria is the same, but if you, it's not equitable to the people that have property and resource protection currently that shouldn't be.
Well, to be fair, what do you mean by shouldn't be? Because if you're saying, hey, this looks good where it already exists, so that's what it should be. Because shouldn't be is, if it's mapped currently, it should be. If it's not mapped
I
currently, it
disagree
shouldn't
with
be.
that premise though, because I think
Because even
if it's
phase
mapped-
one
can I
introduces
finish
new
my statement,
criteria.
Joe? If it's mapped currently, we know that the origin of that map, the old one before that was updated 218, was not the result of a public deliberation process that represented the values of the community. It was largely imposed by the state based upon what that 100-year floodplain was. It
And
wasn't the
swamps.
result of a large
Yeah.
public input process.
But it wasn't just the floodplain.
No,
It
no,
also
you're right, not
included
just
swamp
that,
areas
but
and other
even George
features.
started the meeting
Yeah.
showing this is what the old 100-year floodplain was, and it is remarkably similar, almost exactly the same as what our current resource protection map is. So we really, you know, there's no.
So I have a question about
There's no
floodplain.
agenda here to add or subtract the net, net increase or net decrease resource protection. The only agenda is to make sure that all property owners are treated fairly. And it's not fair for people that shouldn't have property and resource protection to have to stay that way if the town, for instance, voted the single question down because there wasn't appetite to add things to resource protection.
So I have a clarification question. So like in areas right here, that's currently mapped as resource protection, if you were to just switch that to floodplain, part of the floodplain actually increases here. So would your phase one also be to, if we're concerned about the floodplain, to also add those properties that are now captured by the floodplain that weren't previously?
That's the second question. That's like, do we
But if
add-
we're tying first question to floodplain, there will be property, there is data that show that like this small parcel right here gets added in just by the new LiDAR data. So would your first phase say,
But it's
don't
not
add
current-
those,
It's
don't,
not currently identified.
but by
though,
your
right?
argument, we should include that because that now meets a criteria of floodplain.
Right, it would
and they
be
have to get
included
flood
in the second
insurance.
question, but it's not currently marked as in
But then we're
resource
kind of in a
protection right now,
situation
right?
where we're saying, you have to follow floodplain guidance unless you're this person who doesn't have to.
No,
because
that
it
would-
is though, if phase one goes through and phase two doesn't.
No, it's not, because in phase one,
But phase two shows that there are areas that need to be floodplain mapped based off of the LiDAR. Well, I'm just saying that it's not a correct statement, so phase one shows that we're taking some things out, but there are floodplains that are mapped by LiDAR, which we're saying is the nexus of this discussion, that we need to be sticking to the floodplain data. There are floodplains that would extend under phase two, because that is the LiDAR data, but we're not capturing that on
right,
phase one.
but those are not, those areas that you just mentioned are not showing on the current map as being in resource protection, so those aren't part of the question in number one. All number one is saying is, if property is currently showing on the map as in resource protection, and it doesn't meet any of those criteria, of which 100-year floodplain is one of them, so then take it out. If there's any area that's currently marked resource protection that does meet that criteria, would not be proposed to come out, because that's the criteria that would be applied if question 2 passed, to keep it in.
And if question 2 didn't pass, then we would say, we're counting a floodplain except in these spots where the floodplain we know to exist with the updated data.
The way
Well,
question one
but
now
again,
is-
that's 2 different questions. It's
Right,
not
but
just
what I'm
about-
saying-
Can I
yeah.
finish, please?
Oh, I know, I understand what you're
It's not
saying.
just about the floodplain, right? So you're right, and whether it's the floodplain or some other criteria, it's a matter of fixing the map, right? So if the map shows it and it's not, and it shouldn't be there, we need to take it out. And we need to vote on whether we take it out. The town may vote yes or no on that. And then, as you say, there are areas that should be identified that aren't, and we need to vote on that. The town may vote yes or no on that, but we can't structure the votes based upon how we want the end result to come out. We gotta have integrity in the process and ask the honest
But it
questions.
seems like the vote's kind of being structured that way if we're considering it in these 2 phases. When we say,
Just
we
the
need to-
opposite, frankly.
if we say we need to fix the map, we're saying it's broken. So we need to fix it so it meets these criteria, but only in some places. And then we need to fix it again so it meets this criteria and the rest of the place. So I think the language fix and broken might not necessarily accurately describe the situation. Is my thought process on it.
Maybe question 1 is align with the floodplain. If it takes you out, it takes you out. If it puts you in, it puts you in.
Right, and that's a different question.
Question 2 is all these other more subjective,
And-
what's important to us.
And that
as
would be a
town.
different question to align with the floodplain, because the floodplain data would show that it increases in some areas along the
That's
interstate.
okay.
So, yes, sir?
One of the people who spoke at the town meeting said they were gonna vote no because the town didn't contact adjacent property owners as required by state law.
For this ordinance
Last
discussion?
year at the town meeting, and we voted on this one.
I'm sorry, state your question is
So
whether.
one of the people who spoke, who said they were gonna vote no, said they were gonna vote no because state law required that not only affected property owners, but adjacent property owners were required to be contacted. And that only affected property owners had been contacted. So I wanna know if that will be resolved before the town meeting.
Yeah, I think George
here?
looked into that question,
Yeah.
whether we had to alert adjacent, whether the town has to alert adjacent property
You
owners or not.
definitely do not have to alert or notify a butter. Even questionable whether you need to notify the property owners that are affected. This has been done as a courtesy, trying to engage in the public discussion, so we're not doing this because the law required it, we're doing this because it's the right thing to do.
Somebody.
I know somebody raised that question,
Yeah, and
and
they
Joe
popped up an
after.
ordinance on their phone and. read
Yep,
the
Joe
ordinance.
asked me to clarify it, and I did look at it, and there's no requirement that you notify butters.
Yeah, but like obviously we wanna see more people, even the unaffected, hearing this information. That's why we're having these extra discussions and important conversations, you know, for sure. Oh, yep,
So, yeah, I have a property that both will be affected by question 1 and question 2, different areas
Double
we've taken
whammy.
out and areas we put in, and I mean, I will say, having looked at the maps, pretty closely, because went through planning board process this year and appeal board process around this, the new maps really reflect what feels accurate to our land, and so I really appreciate having accurate maps and accurate information that, you know, really reflects how we can protect resources in our town. And so I'm definitely, you know, would love to see both questions 1 and 2 pass. And I also really would agree that it makes sense to apply it as a fair, equitable process overall, that we apply the accurate map, period, not, because I do worry about if question 1 passes and then question 2 does not pass, what happens then? And I'm wondering, maybe, I don't know if that's a select board question or concept, but like, what happens then? Do we then like go through this process again for another, you know, couple of years where we kind of debate it for, you know, throughout this process and, and end up in that time having less land and resource protection, more development happening, and then more, and maybe that development happens and then it ends up in resource protection in 2 years, and someone bought that property thinking, oh, it's not, and now it is. So to me, it just seems like making it one clear, decisive vote would be good, and really, see how we can come together as a town and say, hey, we want to protect the rural nature of this town. We want to protect the resources of this town. We like clean water. We like clean air. We like having animals and wildlife that are coexisting with us. And trying to have that as being something as one clear vote. If the select board doesn't agree that it can be 2 votes, then I feel like it needs to be, or that it can be 1 vote. Then I feel like, hey, we need to figure out how can we come together to really vote conclusively as 1 vote. So, but I put it back to you. If we vote down question 2, what happens then? And what would be the process to actually get to being in a place where we have resources protected? Because I just worry about, as I think Jane was saying before, we take stuff out and we have more and more development. So.
Yeah, well, I mean, ultimately, that's definitely something that could happen, but that only happens if the voters vote that way, right? I mean, that's ultimately what drives it. I mean, it's based on what the voters say. So I would turn that question around a little bit and say, well, what if it's all one question, and it fails, because there's definitely, you can definitely foresee an all-in question failing, because there's definitely a vibe in here that there's not a lot of appetite for adding a significant amount of additional land to resource protection. I think that vote could go either way. So if it was all one question and it failed, what happens to the property owner that their land shouldn't be in resource protection really in the first place, but now they're still subject to those conditions? And I would point out that the comprehensive plan had 3 main elements in it, and only 2 have really been mentioned here tonight. One was to preserve the rural character, and I was chair of that committee, so I kind of know what I'm talking about here. Preserve the rural character, preserve agriculture and forestry, but the 3rd one was private property rights, and balancing those.
Yeah, and I mentioned that at the onset. So in that vein, before we take more questions, I just wanted to take a quick moment, and we talk a lot about resource protection tonight. We haven't really quantified what that means. In some instances we've mentioned what it does and doesn't mean. So in our Durham land use ordinance that was adopted most recently, we have a couple pages that highlights what you can and can't do in resource protected areas, and whether you need a permit or whether it's not permissible. So these are some common questions we have gotten. Can I still farm? Yes. I own resource protected property, and my goats graze it, and my ducks and geese graze it, no problem. Can you do forest management? Yes, at a commercial scale you can, and just at a private scale. So if you're just cutting a couple cord off your woodlot every year, that's still allowed. Can you hunt, fish, and hike? Yes, that's permissible. Motor vehicle use on existing trails and roads? Yes, so if there's a snowmobile trail or a 4-wheeler trail and an area becomes resource protected, that is still permissible. Private roads. So if you now own property and the resource protection makes you feel like you can't access the back lot of your property that isn't resource protected, you can get a permit to put in private road. So these are some of the common things. Things that you can't do: extract gravel, build a home, add an addition into that area. Those are kind of the major ones. Any sort of thing that the municipality might need to do, like if we needed a transmission line, or if there needed to be an access road or some sort of fire management thing, that's allowed. And I just wanted to clarify for anyone, did anyone have any other questions about things that they were concerned about doing and wanted to know whether resource protection on their property impacted that? Yep, you sir?
What falls in resource protection? Would you have to have it done?
I think so. I think that would be a discussion I would code enforcement officer. I don't want to speak for him, but I would imagine that there would be grandfathering where we would say, if your house is in resource protection after it was added, I can't imagine us saying, the town saying, tear it down or move it. So, but that's definitely a question George might be able to answer.
This has come up in a couple of cases where you have someone whose home is currently in resource protection, addition or subdivide. So basically, if they want to create a separate lot in the resource protection and build a house on it, that is not permitted. However, there are specific allowances for expanding existing non-conforming properties, and there are some rules that limit how much expansion you can do, but there is a process that you go through to determine whether you can expand or not within the resource protection.
For example, I built my house 21 years ago. What if, so if it suddenly became resource protection, would I be there?
Yes.
And the other thing I want to say on construction real quickly too is, resource protection can be part of open space. So if there's a development in town and the back half of the parcel is resource protected, that can be included as part of their open space requirement if the developer so chooses. So for some of these larger lots that might feel like they're losing development on the back half, that can still be utilized as part of their development in that regard. Yeah.
Can I build a pond in resource protection?
Ponds are tricky because ponds, you go a level higher than us. That kind of gets to the Maine Department of Environmental Protection in terms of building ponds and their permitting, so that's probably gonna fall more towards them. You know, we have in here, wildlife management practices are allowed. If you're building a wildlife pond, that's probably still something you would have to talk to Maine DEP about, but.
It's probably gonna depend where you're doing it.
Yeah. Because, for example, ponds get permitted if you're trying to build a pond within a floodplain or within a wetland complex or along the edge of a stream. You do need a Maine state permit, and that's a whole different process. So, well, that's at our hands.
This lady who asked her.
Deb Oliver, Cottage Woods Road. I'd just like to say I'm in favor of changing question 1 to line up with the updated map and not adding the new 6 other criterias and including the criteria that represents the updated map.
Okay,
That we
so
heard here.
that's not
I know.
us,
I'm
but I just
saying
want to
if-
clarify.
I don't know
You're
how the
saying
select board,
you are in favor of adopting it all in one vote, including the updated map that George just showed with all the 6 criteria, the additions and the
No, I think if
subtractions?
there's gonna be 2 questions, the first question should get the land use in line with the updated map,
So you're saying add, and then if there's a second question, subtract?
yes.
Okay, that's not our prerogative, that's
I
feedback.
just think the
for-
way, the
select board.
criteria is being applied to the first question today is not fair to all.
So, a couple of years ago, I went to a planning board meeting and we talked about the mapping and that it was not, precise enough, so that if I wanted to do something on my property, the onus fell on me to do a wetlands delineation survey, correct? My
I wasn't
question-
at that meeting.
I was, yes.
Okay, so with the new, didn't we get new GIS? I know George was developing maps, but I thought we got a new system.
That's what I've been using.
Okay, so the new system, is it precise enough now, like the other gentleman was saying, how did you draw those lines? Is it precise enough that it would allow us not to have that, wetland
No.
delineation survey?
None of the
at
GIS
cost of
data
us?
provided by the state is accurate enough to make development decisions on individual properties. That requires surveyors, engineers, and wetland scientists.
Yeah, so, for example, a lot of this data here is just showing what would be in resource protection. There could be wetlands and vernal pools and aquifers or other natural resources that are scattered throughout a property, and there are state level compliance requirements for like filling wetlands. So if you're trying to put in a development, you would still need to do your wetland delineation, potential soil surveys and stuff like that to show that you're meeting the state regulations. So you would be able to say, we are outside of Durham's resource protection zone, so there is no nexus for us to have to go through the town, and the town is saying that you're outside of the area where there are restrictions, but you would still have to deal with any sort of other state or federal permitting.
But I was thinking that even if that green line touched your property, that mandated that you got a wetland delineation.
No, it means that you can't work
In that.
within that area. So if it only cuts into the back corner, like my property, there's a stream, it's the floodplain area and some wetlands, but everything I've built is 300 feet away from it. So it doesn't impact the whole property just because part of it is touched by resource protection.
So someone mentioned, I think Kevin, that we're voting on an ordinance change. What ordinance are we voting on?
Land use ordinance and zoning map, which is part of the land use ordinance.
But we're changing the ordinance?
Yes.
The zoning
Yeah.
map is part of the land use
And we're also putting those specific criteria into the ordinance, which are not in the ordinance right now.
Right?
So if we're voting on an ordinance change, why don't we create an ordinance that makes this automatic in the future? That all the subjects, there's no question about it.
So are you saying like have it written so
It
you would
doesn't,
say
it doesn't
update
work that way.
floodplains annually, or?
No, you have the criteria in the ordinance, and then based on
The
that,
specific pieces of land are in the ordinance?
no, the criteria. So all land that is 10 acres or greater, wetland, that would be included on the zoning map, but creating the zoning map, which then puts it on the ground on a specific piece of property is a separate issue. It's a separate step.
But why can't the ordinance say what we're trying to accomplish with this vote?
Because it's a combination of a zoning map and an ordinance that regulates the property.
You can't include the zoning map in the ordinance?
It is part of the zoning ordinance, but you can zone different areas of the town based on those criteria and not zone other areas. Okay? It's a policy decision that has to be made by the governing legislative authority, which here is town meeting.
Does that answer?
I don't get it, but I'll get clarification there.
Heather?
There was a time when we were, I don't know if it was when we were updating shoreland or when we were updating the ordinance as an entire thing, that I had to go through a review process to make sure, like at the state level,
That was
to make.
shoreline zoning.
It was shoreline zoning, okay. So my question would be, is there a process or an option like that would take our comprehensive plan and take the proposed language? Because they did a read-through of what we were gonna put out to the voters, right? Because part of this, to me, feels like there's a discrepancy in what the comp plan says versus what is being put out to vote. And it's very clear in state statute that it has to be, like the language actually says, pursuant to and consistent with a comprehensive plan adopted by the municipal legislative body. So is there some other entity at the state level that looks at that and says whether or not it is pursuant to and consistent with? Because if it's not, then we get into a situation where landowners or potential developers can challenge the rules.
There was a process that was started down that track at the state planning office when there was still a state planning office. And it was just a nightmare. And they politically at the state level gave up on it. So basically, these cases of its consistency or inconsistency with a comprehensive plan are decided by courts. Town of Scarborough had their comprehensive plan, kind of like the Scarborough Downs area, it's all being redeveloped, right? There was another area down at Dunstan where the comprehensive plan said do all of this type of development. And when they proposed it, the project, the neighbors came out of the woodwork, which usually happens, and said, you can't let them destroy our life, and overturn it, the zoning change, and that went to the Maine Supreme Court, and they said, no, it has to be, they followed the comprehensive plan, and you can't now reverse that when they follow the comprehensive plan. So that's how it gets done, when it gets challenged, if it gets challenged.
Okay, and so just, everybody knows the growth pressure that Durham's under, and I think in the best interest of the town, not getting into legal arguments in a court situation would probably be in our best interest, and therefore really put out language and changes that aligns very closely to
That's
the
what we're
comprehensive
trying to
plan.
do.
Yeah,
That's what
no,
we're
I
trying to
appreciate it,
do.
George. I know you've worked really hard on this, thank you. And I have to say how much I appreciate that we're having this meeting in December and not waiting until March to do this, so thank you very much.
Amen, I agree with you.
More communication is better, so. You had your hand up? Before Heather, you had your hand up?
I think I'm good.
Okay. So are there any other questions about allowable versus non-allowable uses in resource protection? The list is available on the town's website. I've got some copies printed off here for anyone who wants one. We can answer any questions.
Quick question about forest management.
Yep.
If you have property, some of it is in my case in tree growth.
Yeah.
Does that, you still have people go in there and do what they've been doing to maintain the rules, whatever they are for the tree growth?
Could you, so,
She's saying, would this stop the forest management
No.
for tree growth?
no, so you can,
I'm sorry?
You're saying, would this affect your
Yeah.
keeping the tree growth
yeah,
requirements?
no,
now?
this doesn't impact that. So tree growth
I
designation
mean, I don't
is-
like it much, but I'm trying to follow the rules,
Yeah,
you know.
so tree growth just says you have to manage for commercial forestry product.
Well, you went to the
is-
word commercial, that's what Nick.
Yeah, well, that's Maine Forest Service's language, not ours. So they're saying you have to manage for a commercial forestry product, and your plan gets reevaluated every 10 years. Whether your property is in resource protection or not does not impact that.
It's separate,
It's
okay.
separate, yeah.
Okay,
So
thank you.
if it went in or out, you can still maintain your forest management plan and your forest management activities, so. Heather?
I just wanna say to the people who own property that's going to be impacted in a way that more, if it passes, that more of their land goes into resource protection, that I do remember a conversation where there were like 4 different programs that offered significant, tax benefits, where the people who are saying they're not, they have no intention of developing, that's not what they bought their land for, that's not what they're keeping their land for. There are tax benefit programs that do exist for you if you're interested in putting your property into a situation where it doesn't get developed and then you do receive, you know, based on whatever the criteria are, to be able to have those tax benefits. I think
Yeah, and
Brian,
that's-
who used to be on the planning
That's a
board, talked
separate,
about that.
that's a separate topic, but that's something on the Conservation Commission that we know a lot about. So if you, outside of this whole discussion, just wanna utilize that, it's called Open Space Program. Most of you are probably familiar with tree growth, but there's other designations that reduce your tax liability. You could reach out to our Conservation Commission, and we could gladly point you in the right direction and explain the program if you're interested. It's a state level program.
So I've been sitting here brainstorming the whole one question, 2 question thing, and I've come up with what I think might be a solution to that. And I think we do both. I think we could ask, the first question could be the all-in question, right? Do you approve the map that has the additions, the subtractions, the whatever? And if that passes, we don't have to ask the next couple of questions. But if it doesn't pass for some reason, then you ask the questions individually. Like you say, okay, the all-in failed, so now let's vote, okay, do you can we take out the stuff that shouldn't be there using whatever we decided, or should we put in the stuff that we feel should be?
So are you recommending a question that would be like, adopt the 6 criteria as shown in this map, which George has already made? If that were to fail at this town meeting, then the subsequent town meetings.
No, immediately.
No, same meeting. It's actually, it's something that you can do, like, you can put contingency questions on the warrant. So you put the all-in question on, and then if that passes, then the next 2 become moot, because you've already passed it. And then you just move past those questions. If the question fails.
So that would be this map.
Right, so it's the all-in, what comes, you know, the one question thing that a lot of people have advocated for. If that passes, we're done. If it doesn't pass, then we go to,
That one.
something like, okay, so then we, whatever it is, whatever we land on, you know, I think there's still some work to be done on how we word the what to take out, what to put in. But I think that could accomplish both things, because the concern of the board has been that people who have property that shouldn't, you know, as we
That
talked
doesn't
about
meet
now,
these
shouldn't be
criteria,
there,
yeah.
would have no remedy if you only ask one question and and it fails. At least this would provide a potential remedy if that happens.
So the new question one would be to adjust the map to meet the 6 criteria outlined in resource.
As expressed in the
And that would
comprehensive plan.
include pulling everything out and putting all the things in.
Like, this is
And
the
then if
net
that
new
failed, we would go through line by line. You know,
Could,
let's go with a
or-
100-year, let's go with this, let's go,
Yeah.
because my only question with that is, if that was the case, we would probably wanna have another meeting like this where the Conservation Commission can explain what each one of those mean, and we would have to go through each map to say, here's what the 100-year floodplain looks like, here's what the IWWH looks like, here's what this one looks like, here's what it looks like if number 1 goes through and number 3 does, but number 2 doesn't, and all those sorts of iterations. So I just think that'd be more education and outreach.
You're gonna have a really colorful map.
Yeah, perhaps, you know, but.
Less green is what you're saying, add some purples and yellows in there, yeah.
I like this, I just wanna clarify one point, when you're saying all in, you're saying apply these criteria evenly across the board as all in. When you're saying all in, you don't mean all in like land that's currently identified in addition to this. You're saying your version of what all in is this evenly across town.
It is a map that reflects the criteria articulated in the comprehensive plan.
I love it,
Approve
That's
phase
this.
1 and
That's
phase
this
2
Yeah.
simultaneously.
Right.
I love it.
I like the contingency piece.
Right, and then there's remedy, if for some reason that fails, then there's at least potential, the opportunity for remedy
To go through.
to go through.
Yeah, so my question, in a situation like that, this one fails, you're going back to the base map, and you're now saying,
The existing.
the existing map, and saying, add, let's vote on number 1, 2, 3, or 4 to be added there. What,
Changes.
how do you make sure that people who don't meet any of the new criteria would be removed?
That
in
would be the first question.
So, it would automatically be removed.
Yeah, whether it's, you know, however, I mean, there's been a couple of thoughts expressed tonight on how that question should be expressed, but, yeah, so, I think, there's obviously details to work out, but I would like to find a way that wouldn't require pushing, if it failed, off another year. I think we have enough
I think
time,
we all
that we
wanna
can be ready for.
Vote on it and be done.
Yeah, I think we can be ready with other scenarios if for some reason the all-in option.
Maybe you could have Kevin, maybe you could have 3 community members be in the discussion of the question, development stage, like you did for the common.
Doesn't have, anybody is always welcome to be in the discussion. I don't know when that discussion will actually happen or whether it'll be in a planning board meeting or a select board meeting or I'm not sure.
Are there still 12 days of Christmas?
Yeah, George's County. Yeah.
I just want to say thank you for all of your help in explaining, and then thank you for Kevin to be open-minded enough to say, hey, this might work.
I think this discourse is important. All right, so any other questions about this, you can reach out to us as a Conservation Commission. Like I said, we're trying to recruit a new member as well, so.
Please sign up if you want detailed analysis on that sheet back there. Make sure you check it off.